For 400 years, Black Americans have been handed a version of their own story, written by the people who enslaved them. Names erased, languages forbidden, kingdoms reduced to a single line in a ship's manifest: cargo, quantity, value. The Yoruba farmer and the Mandinka warrior, and the Wolof merchant and the Igbo weaver were all collapsed into one word, stripped of everything that made them who they were before the ships came. But there is a community living today on a chain of low-lying islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia that was never fully collapsed. A community so geographically isolated, so linguistically distinct, so culturally intact, that when genetic scientists finally sequenced their DNA and compared it to populations across the world, the results stopped researchers in their tracks. What they found was not just ancestry. What they found was a time capsule. What slavery tried to erase, your DNA preserved. And nowhere on American soil is that statement more scientifically provable than among the Gullah Geechee people of the Sea Islands. If you are curious about ancestry, genetics, or the truth hidden in our blood, hit subscribe. To understand what the DNA found, you have to understand what the trade created. Between roughly 1650 and 1800, the British colonies of South Carolina and Georgia built an agricultural empire on the cultivation of rice. Rice, unlike tobacco or indigo, required a very specific kind of knowledge. The Mandinka and the Wolof of Senegambia, the region covering present-day Senegal, Gambia, and Guinea-Bissau, had been cultivating rice in river floodplains for centuries. The Temne of Sierra Leone understood tidal irrigation. The Mende and the Kru knew the rhythms of the land the colonizers were trying to transform. So the planters of the Carolina Lowcountry did not simply buy enslaved people at random from any port that was selling. They sought out specific peoples from the Windward Coast and the Senegambia region with deliberate commercial intent. They paid premium prices at the slave markets of Charleston for men and women whose agricultural knowledge made them invaluable. The Kingdom of Congo and the Mbundu of West Central Africa fed the Deep South Cotton Belt. The Fon and the Yoruba of the Bight of Benin poured into Louisiana and the sugar economy of the Caribbean. Senegambia flowed directly and heavily into the rice islands of South Carolina and Georgia. Because those islands were surrounded by water and plagued by diseases that killed white overseers at devastating rates, the enslaved populations there were often left alone in ways that no plantation community further inland ever was. That isolation is the key to everything that follows. In the early 21st century, as consumer DNA testing made it possible to sequence populations at scale, scientists began to ask this question. When you measure the genetic ancestry of the Gullah Geechee people today, after 400 years of American history, after slavery, after emancipation, after the migrations that scattered Black Americans from the Sea Islands to cities across the country, how much of the original Senegambian lineage actually survived? The answer was not what most researchers expected. It was not a whisper of the past. It was a shout. And the data that came back from those Sea Island samples forced the scientific community to reckon with something it had not fully anticipated: that geography had done what no law, no document, and no master's ledger could do. It had preserved a bloodline. What most people assume about Black American DNA is that 4 centuries of forced proximity, sexual violence under slavery, post-emancipation migration, and intermarriage across different Black American lineages would have blended the original source populations into something too mixed to trace with precision. And for most Black Americans, that assumption is largely correct. Studies across large Black American populations suggest that, on average, roughly 75 to 80% of Black American DNA traces to West and West Central Africa, with the remaining percentage drawn from European admixture and, to a much smaller degree, other sources. That broad West African signal is real, and it is powerful. But it is also a composite. Dozens of source populations folded together across generations until the specific ethnic thread becomes difficult to isolate. Think of it like a jar filled with marbles of different colors. If you pour several jars together and shake them for 400 years, you can tell that the marbles came from different places, but you can no longer be certain which specific jar any individual marble came from. The Gullah Geechee jar was barely poured into at all, and what scientists found when they opened it was extraordinary. Research published by geneticists analyzing sea island populations found Senegambian ancestry concentrations in Gullah Geechee communities that are, by some estimates, among the highest recorded for any Black American population on the continent. Studies suggest that in certain Gullah Geechee lineages, Senegambian-specific genetic signatures account for a significantly elevated share of total ancestry compared to Black Americans sampled from urban centers in the North or the Deep South interior. The Wolof, the Mandinka, the Serer, the Temne. These are not generic categories in Gullah Geechee DNA. They are traceable threads, and they are traceable precisely because the geography of the sea islands acted as a genetic preservative. The creeks and marshes and ocean channels that separated the islands from the mainland were not just barriers to escape. They were, without anyone intending it, barriers to the dilution that time and migration impose everywhere else. What slavery tried to erase, your DNA preserved. Nowhere in Black America is that sentence more literally, measurably true. To stand in that truth fully, you have to name what was taken. When enslavers loaded men and women onto ships in the ports of Dakar and Banjul and Freetown, they were not only capturing bodies, they were severing something that human beings in every culture across history have considered sacred: the chain of named ancestors, the knowledge of who you came from and therefore who you were. The Mandinka had oral genealogies stretching back dozens of generations. The Wolof had griots, professional keepers of lineage, whose entire life's purpose was the preservation of a family's history through memory and voice. When those people arrived in the sea islands, their griot had not survived the crossing. Their language was banned. Their names were replaced with the names of the men who owned them. Their children were given English first names chosen by strangers and surnames that were never theirs. The ancestral chain was not just broken. It was deliberately and systematically burned. And yet the DNA carried on beneath all of it. The haplogroups did not change because a name changed. The genetic markers did not shift because a language was forbidden. In the Gullah Geechee specifically, something remarkable happened. Because their isolation limited the degree of outside genetic contribution, the lineages they carried from Senegambia in 1670 and 1680 and 1700 are still visible today, readable by science, restorable to families who had been told for generations that the answer to the question of where they came from was simply, we don't know. What slavery tried to erase, your DNA preserved. Genetic studies indicate that while the average Black American carries detectable levels of European admixture, research suggests somewhere in the range of 17 to 24% on average across large sample sets. Gullah Geechee populations show measurably lower European admixture, consistent with the historical record of their reduced contact with white populations during and after slavery. Their mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line passed from mother to daughter across generations without recombination, shows West African haplogroup signatures at rates that researchers have described as unusually high for an American population. Specific Y chromosome haplogroups tracing to Senegambia appear in Sea Island male lineages at concentrations that distinguish them from Black American populations sampled in Virginia, the Carolinas, interior Piedmont region, or the urban centers of the Great Migration. The Gullah language itself, a Creole that fuses English with Wolof, Mandinka, Mende, and Kru grammatical structures and vocabulary, is now understood by linguists to be not a degraded form of English, but a sophisticated, purposeful synthesis. It is the sound of what happens when people who spoke Wolof and Mandinka and Temne were forced to find a common tongue, and built one that carried their roots forward inside its grammar. The language and the DNA are telling the same story. What the Gullah Geechee case makes undeniable is something that the broader history of race in the United States has always tried to obscure: that Black Americans are not a monolithic, origin-less population. The concept of race as a biological category is a construction, invented to justify a hierarchy. But the ancestral specificity that existed before that construction was real. The Mandinka farmer, the Wolof merchant, the Temne rice cultivator. Science can now see it. Consumer DNA testing companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA have enrolled millions of Black Americans in the last decade, and the database built from those tests is giving researchers tools their predecessors never had. For families who received their results and saw the word Senegambia on the screen, the reaction is often not surprise, but recognition. Something they felt in the food, in the music, in the way their grandmothers arranged the land around them. Science arrives to confirm what the gut already knew. Every Black American carries a history that no plantation ledger could fully contain. But the Gullah Geechee of the Sea Islands carry something specific and irreplaceable. They hold the most intact genetic record of Senegambian ancestry in the United States, a living biological archive of the Mandinka, the Wolof, the Temne, and the Serer. That archive was preserved not by any deliberate act of remembrance, but by the channels, the marshes, and the ocean water that slavery used as a cage, and that time quietly transformed into a vault. The Gullah Geechee did not just survive, they preserved. They preserved a language. They preserved a cuisine. They preserved a relationship with land and water, and basket weaving techniques that archaeologists can trace directly to the Senegambia region. They preserved, in their cells, a genetic record so concentrated and so specific that it is rewriting what we understand about how much of the past can survive the worst that history can do. What slavery tried to erase, your DNA preserved. Even when names were changed, even when languages were banned, even when family trees were burned and the griot's voice was silenced on the other side of the Atlantic, the genes held on. The blood remembered, and it is remembering still.